So what he's done here is generalize the concern. So the question now comes up, could American Jewry have done more? What could they have done? And it remains highly contentious. Some blame Jewish leaders for doing too little. Some condemn Jewish organizations for their inability to unite. We talked about that last week. They didn't know what to do and they had different opinions. Some argue that American Jews should have increased their pressure on governmental agencies. Some point at missed opportunities all the way along the way. There are others who say, however, they conclude sadly that no matter what would have done, little would have made a difference. And they look at and they point out the following factors. You have anti-immigrant sentiment here in the United States. You weren't going to open the doors. That's the argument. 2, there's this persistent sense of isolationism that's existing. 3, there's burgeoning anti-Semitism across the country. 4, you've got the politics of expediency, coupled with the president's insistence that the best way to save Jews was to win the war. All right. And so the arguments from we couldn't have done more are based on all that. The reality is one way or another, and I'm not here to judge history, but by all accounts, Hitler's incredible determination to annihilate the Jews clearly exceeded the American willpower to stop it. The first question then, the underlying question is what would have been enough? What is sufficiency in such a case? And it's not an easy question to ask. What would have been enough given the cataclysmic events of the Holocaust? What real power did American Jewry truly have? Because the community itself was fractious. We've talked about this. The religious bond that no longer unified Jews in America. We were all over the place in our religious perspectives, as we are today. We can't agree on anything. And you also have, at the same time, as I mentioned last week, the Yiddish-speaking culture is on the wane. So the normal tools that would have unified, and I don't know that would have made a difference, but the normal tools of unification were on the wane. And what's paradoxical about it is in the anti-Semitic imagination, the Jews were a unified and conspiratorial group. As the old joke, you want to feel good about Jews, read what the anti-Semites write. We've got a lot of power if you ask them. All right. We feel we're powerless. They feel we have all the power. So there's nagging doubts. We don't know. We don't know. Had they been even a little more successful? What's the right amount of success? A little more success might have helped. Had they been better at opening the gates? Had they been better in pressuring Britain to open the gates of Palestine? Had they been better at shaming the world to find other havens for the Jews of Europe? Some people would have been saved. There's no way really to make sense of it. And unfortunately, there'll be a question that stays with us throughout history. I imagine the same kinds of things happened after the Inquisition and other moments in Jewish history. What else could have been done? And they remain unresolved. All right, let's go on to after the war itself. The joy, 1945 comes, we win. There's a joy felt throughout America, and American Jews are certainly celebrating, but it carries with it a sadness, because what happens at this point is becoming aware of the full impact of what happened in the Holocaust. They knew what was going on, but the sheer degree to which it was going on was now being made fully known. Most had discussed, was clear. They had lost relatives. They had lost friends in Europe. The world's most vibrant Jewish cultural and intellectual center. This was the core. This was the central component of Jewish life is gone. All right. People here, there's probably survivor guilt because they realized they had escaped the fate of European Jewry only because their ancestors had made a decision to emigrate from Europe. It's sheer luck. So what happens? In the post-war era, you've got a major responsibility for the economic and the social rehabilitation of the survivors of the Holocaust that lands on American Jewry. We've got to fix. Before assuming this task, however, there's a bigger picture question that American Jews have to ask, and that is the Jewish existence. Does it have a purpose following the Holocaust? And a minority of Americans truly did make the decision that the price of identifying had become too high. For them, the gas chambers of Hitler was the end of Jewish history. Wouldn't it be better, they argued, for everyone if Jews simply disappeared and there'd be no anti-Semitism? And they asked, what rational cause could there be made for affirming a Jewish identity after Auschwitz? Perhaps the greatest and most remarkable aspect of American Jewish life after 1945 was the rejection of that argument and insistence on remaining positive. America had become, after the destruction of the European community, the most important Jewish community in the world. Nowhere else were there the numbers, the wealth, the intellectual resources. The burden of Jewish leadership shifted across the Atlantic Ocean and now rested on this upstart group of Americans who were immigrants or the children of immigrants. This is not a settled community. And suddenly, they're in charge. The tasks included not only supporting the remnants of European Jewry and aiding the struggle of the Jewish community in Palestine, which happens over the next few years, but also in trying to create a vibrant Jewish life here in America, one that the younger generation could identify as a reason for remaining Jewish. There's a lot on their plate. For an immigrant group, there's a lot on their plate. From our lens looking back, the most striking fact is that they did fulfill these responsibilities. It's truly an unbelievable undertaking and success. What's going through the minds of Jews at this point on a collective? There's a sense of having just discovered what happened in Europe, the vulnerability of the Jewish condition is accentuated by the fact that the fate of European Jewry had mattered very little to the Allied powers. Military strategists had not been swayed by the need to liberate the Nazi death camps and to end the slaughter as soon as possible. Neither had the United States or Britain favored admitting in the victims before or after, and England adamantly opposed creating a land in Palestine. Even a proposal brought to the US Congress in late 30s to admit just 20,000 Jewish children from Germany could not be passed. 1939, nearly 2/3 of Americans opposed special quotas for Jewish children from Europe, despite the fact that the alternative was what played out. You kind of see the same kinds of things, in war-torn parts of the world where they try to send children here, et cetera. We've seen similar things, and I don't want to get too political, but it's hard for a Jew not to recognize the parallels. Jews did suspect that the Holocaust had not changed the attitude of the great powers and the citizens towards Jewish victimization. After the war, the borders of Palestine remained closed. Even Roosevelt, a revered figure in the Jewish community, remarked that upon returning from the Yalta Conference in February of '46, that he had a brief meeting with the king of Saudi Arabia, and he finally understood the concerns of the Palestinians. So if Palestine was not to be an option, where could the survivors of the Holocaust go? No, none of them wanted to go back to Eastern Europe, as you can well imagine. 1945, Jews continued to be murdered in Poland. Many of them were taken into Russia. All right, and so life was continuing to be awful. Furthermore, there was little likelihood of any change of American immigration policy to admit any of these displaced Jews. It also, these events as they're being discovered, did little to affect American public opinion in the immediate years following the war. The award-winning movie Stalag 17, 1953, for example, portrayed the conditions of a prisoner of a war camp in Germany without once mentioning anti-Semitism or the fate of Europe's Jews. Movies and books would not make an impact in the United States for at least a decade after the war's end. It would seem this is where the Cold War has begun, and the American public could only be concerned with one totalitarian concern at a time. The threat from the Soviet Union, preempted interest in the Nazi horrors, and the status of West Germany as an American ally made Americans reluctant to embarrass Germans by drawing attention to the recent past. American attitudes towards immigration reflected the public indifference. Most Americans remained opposed to the admission of large numbers of refugees, Jewish or otherwise. It wasn't just Jews, but obviously Jews had a particular problem. The particular attitude regarding the Palestine question, where there was support, was also not without anti-immigrant overtones. Vast majorities of Americans favored the Jewish cause and supported the creation of the state of Israel in Palestine. Americans believed that the Holocaust had demonstrated the need for a Jewish homeland, and most believed that the Jews had a religious, legal, and historical claim on the land. Christian fundamentalist groups saw a Jewish homeland as a harbinger of a second coming. But don't miss the fact that a Jewish state, Americans believed, would also relieve the United States of responsibility for absorbing large numbers of displaced persons. Nativism continued to reshape post-war American policy. William Chapman Revercombe, a West Virginia Republican and one of the most influential and fervent senatorial opponents of immigration, claimed, that the European displaced persons, i.e. the Jews, were pro-communist, a curious charge since none of them wanted to go back behind the Iron Curtain. Reading number 4. I'm going to give Martin and Beverly another chance. Okay, you got it?
I got it.
Reading number 4. This is by that senator.
Many of those who seek entrance into this country have little concept of our form of government, Revercombe said in 1947. Certainly, it would be a tragic blunder to bring into our midst those infused with a communistic line of thought, when one of the most important tasks of this government today is to combat and eradicate communism from this country.
Right. So you can see there's a lot. Nothing is ever simple. One of the things I said yesterday is if you're looking for simple answers, they're probably false. All right. Simple. World is a complicated place. Simple answers are not. They're lovely. They make for great slogans, and they're not real. According to polling data, American anti-Semitism reached a new high peak during the war, and with the end of the fighting, American Jews are now debating how they should respond should anti-Semitism continue at those high levels. And what you're seeing is a shift in American Jewish thought. Previously, Jews had gone out of their way to be as inconspicuous as possible, hoping to persuade Gentiles that they presented no threat to American culture. Jewish entertainers, such as Nathan Birnbaum, you know him as George Burns, and Betty Persky, you know her as Lauren Bacall, had anglicized their names. Others went further and changed their noses. Reading number 5 is from George Burns, A Hidden Jew, and Gail, you've got the square.
Burns had to hide his Jewishness. He was Jewish inside, but it stopped in his skin because he couldn't be too Jewish, he said. He and other Jewish show business friends had to join the Hillcrest Country Club because the others barred Jews. So there you would find Burns and Groucho Marx, Jack Benny, Eddie Cantor, Al Jolson, Danny Kaye, Milton Berle, the Ritz Brothers, and George Jessel. I once asked Tommy Smothers if he knew Jack Benny was Jewish. He said no. So these performers were playing to two audiences. The Jewish audience heard them one way, and the Gentile audiences another. It wasn't until 1975 that Burns was finally able to wear his Jewishness with pride when he co-starred with Walter Matthau as an aging Jewish vaudevillian Al Lewis in the movie The Sunshine Boys.
Yeah, it's hard. I don't know if you've ever seen Burns and Allen, but it's
Yeah.
hard to imagine that you couldn't pick up he was Jewish. Retrospectively, it seems self-evident. This was a time of assimilation that went to such extremes that the phenomenon of Jews hanging stockings and placing trees in their homes at Christmas became more common. Now, there's a number, always, as I said to you, there's always factors playing. Jews had no reason at this point to be optimistic. The negativity was based on an overwhelming importance attributed to anti-Semitism, to economic factors which underlie anti-Semitism. It's no coincidence from their perspective, and I've said this many times, that economics affect. It's no coincidence they finally realized that Hitler had assumed power in Germany at the very depths of the Depression. During this time, you have the spread of the KKK. Racist immigration legislation of the 1920s had occurred during economic hardship in rural America. Anti-Semitism flourished, it was believed, only during hard times when it provided the easiness of an economically ravaged scapegoat. The economic prognosis at that point was poor. All right. Virtually every economic pundit predicted a post-war recession at least as bad as that which happened after World War I. Modern war, they believed, was so disruptive of economic relationships that a post-war recession was virtually inevitable. And furthermore, the Depression, not right before the war, they had gone through the Depression in the 30s. And that for them demonstrated that capitalism, by its definition, was inherently unstable. It's still a new model for them. You have to place things in its historical context. Let me stop and take any comments or thoughts before we go on. Yes, Joyce, and then Suzanne.
Oh, sorry.
I have several things. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Several things. The effect of the Holocaust on the Jewish community was one of the things was that the federations after the Holocaust found the Holocaust as being one of the legs of what they could stand on. It was,
It was a unifying event.
Right, it was.
Yeah.
The second thing I wanted to say is that another effect of the Holocaust on the Jewish community was the strong response to the plight of the Soviet Jews, and that that was something that we said never again.
Yeah. And that's we'll get into that a little bit. That's the 1960s and the early 70s. Right. You're right. It's not in the immediate aftermath of war, but it definitely had a role. You're 100% right. Suzanne.
And then the third thing I
sorry.
was going to say is that Jews had to change their names not only in the entertainment industry, but Bob had to change his name in order to get a job in the chemical industry. He sent away requests, for interviews under the name of Goldberg, and never got one reply. Sent away requests to the same companies under the name of Gilbert and got many job offers.
Wow. Yeah, Suzanne.
I was looking at this where it said it wasn't until 1975 that George Burns was finally able to wear his Jewishness with pride. And I'm looking at that date, 1975. I was an adult by then. And I had finished college. I mean, I was working in a very Christian environment. I had no idea that people like Burns, knew he was Jewish, did not feel comfortable until the mid-70s. That's just hitting me with like being hit on the head. That's pretty scary.
Yeah, I agree.
I have a question. Was
Yes.
there any demonstrations in the United States against Hitler? And I seem to remember that Jews went to the president. I don't remember who the names, rabbis went to the president.
Yeah. So yes, I mentioned last week that there was this big, for example, a big rally at Madison Square Garden with 25,000 people who attended, and there were thousands more outside. Beverly, there was not a unity of response. Last week, I talked about the fact that different organizations took different positions. Some said, yes, let's go out and rally. Others were saying we shouldn't, let's not make it worse. And so the lack of Jewish unity also played in this. I'm going to take one or two more comments and then we need to go on. Yes, somebody else before Gail, and then Gail, and that'll be it. Who else? All right, Gail, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to back up to the war. The federal government, their silence and inaction really played into Hitler's campaign against the Jews, that nobody ever wanted them. And if the United States doesn't want them, no one, they're, pretty low. And the other thing was here in the United States, we had Jewish leadership who sided with Roosevelt. And I'm thinking of one in particular, Rabbi Stephen Wise. Just leave everything, don't make waves. That was pretty
Yeah, but you are 100% correct. What you're describing is exactly the fact that there was no unanimity. And I even talked about a letter that came from the European, some representatives of the European Jewry who said, don't make waves. Again, one has to take, it's easy in hindsight to look back and say, what the heck? All right, we don't know what is going to be in America, just as a very brief comment here. And 20 years from now, we'll look back and say, well, we did the right thing or we didn't do the right thing. We don't know. Okay, so it's easy. Hindsight is perfect. But you're right. There was no unanimity, absolutely, among Jews. All right. So there was, I'm going to go on at this point, a positive, all this at the same time has somewhat of a positive impact on American Jewish identity. It's a great watershed in that issue. Military service broadened the cultural perspective of Jewish servicemen, and American Jewry emerged from the struggle convinced that they were no longer an exotic ethnic and religious minority, but now an integral part of American culture, at least in their own eyes. They had finally arrived as both American Jews and Jewish Americans. Prior to World War II, that idea would have seemed bizarre. In 1922, for example, the eminent Harvard philosopher Harry Wolfson had suggested that Jews accept the permanence of American anti-Semitism. Writing at a time when Congress was busy restricting the flow of Jews into America, the KKK is growing rapidly. Wolfson stated that being Jewish was a disability to be endured forever in this country. And you have, in his pamphlet, he wrote reading number 6. Natalie, do you have the reading? No. Okay, Phyllis, you have it. Please, reading 6.
Okay, Escaping Judaism by Harry Wolfson. There are certain problems of life for which no solution is possible. Because of our Judaism, we must be prepared to give up some of the world's goods, even as we must be prepared to make sacrifices because of other disadvantages with which we may happen to be born. Not all men are born equal. Some are born blind, some deaf, some lame, and some are born Jews. The common lot of Jews, even in America, was to be isolated, to be deprived of many social goods and advantages.
All right. So this is a Jew writing in pre-war saying, look, guys, this is real. All right? Stop wasting energies on it. Let's go on. After 1945, this gloomy analysis started to decline in terms of its pervasiveness over the Jewish community. The war had diminished the conflict in the identities of Americans and Jews. And as servicemen and civilians, they had made an important contribution to this great American undertaking in the war. They were part of the effort. All right, and they saw the merging of Jewish and American fate coming together. They believed the Nazis clearly were the greatest enemy of both Jewry and of the United States. And so therefore we have something in common. We have a common enemy, and you know how that works. And so as a result, anti-Semitism was no longer in this process merely one of many prejudices, since the enemy of the United States had identified the Jew as the primary enemy. Jews now have status among the enemy of the Nazis. That's how Jews began to perceive themselves. All right. To Jews of the post-war, the long-standing claim that anti-Semitism was un-American appeared more convincing than ever. Wolfson's view became an aberration. It became an anachronism, a deviation as they understood it from American principles. And so what happens is Jews now fight to eliminate anti-Semitism rather than to try to contain it. It's a shift in the approach to it. After the Holocaust, and there's a reason, again, after the Holocaust, what does anti-Semitism mean? It's no longer just exclusion from clubs and neighborhoods and elite colleges, it's mass murder. It's an existential concept. And to accept it quietly is to cowardly betray the 6 million that they have just discovered had been lost. And so the response to anti-Semitism shifts as they realize that the consequences have shifted. And as a result, you see a new militants regarding anti-Semitism. You begin to see a unity which didn't exist before. The American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, the ADL, and various local community relations joined together in a crusade against anti-Semitism. After the war, these agencies sponsored research into social and psychological roots of anti-Semitism. They lobbied on the state and federal levels for anti-discriminatory legislation. They pressured colleges and professional schools to admit more Jews. They challenged discriminatory behaviors in the courts, and they sponsored local programs to overcome the prejudices the Jews were encountering. In 1946, the Jewish Welfare Board published a 2-volume work describing Jewish contributions to the war effort. It listed over 500,000 Jews who served in the armed forces, 11,000 who died in combat, 24,000 who had been wounded, and 36,000 who had been decorated. So they begin to realize that marketing makes a difference, something the Palestinians have clearly figured out. All right, marketing can make a difference. The presence of Jews in wartime and in post-World War II films reverses. It reverses what was a desemitizing of Hollywood movies in the 30s. During the Depression, Hollywood film executives, mostly Jews, feared that films featuring Jewish characters or Jewish themes would exacerbate anti-Semitism and also be unpopular at the box office. When novels were brought to the screen, the names of the Jewish characters were frequently anglicized. Probably the most famous and the most popular attempt to relate Americans' involvement in World War II to the struggle against anti-Semitism, this is the emergence now, was Herman Wilkes. I'm not sure how to, is his name Wolk or Wook?
Wook, I think.
What?
Wook, Herman Wook.
Okay. Herman, it's one of those words, names I know in writing, I see all the time, and I've never heard anybody say it. All right, I'm going to go with Wook because that's the advice I'm getting. It was Herman Wilkes' 1951 novel, The Caine Mutiny. It won the 1952 Pulitzer Prize for fiction, sold millions of copies, published in 17 foreign languages, and was turned into a successful play and a very popular movie starring Humphrey Bogart, Ben Jonson, and Fred McMurray. Wook was an Orthodox Jew and a fervent American patriot, as well as a naval veteran of World War II. He had participated in 8 Pacific invasions. And so as a result, it's no coincidence in his novel that the leading advocate of the military virtues of discipline, honor, loyalty, and duty is the mutineer's Jewish lawyer. There's a shift that has happened. I'll stop for a couple comments or questions. Okay.
I was just going to say that I've seen the movie, never read the book, but I didn't even remember
The trial.
that the lawyer that he was Jewish.
Right, because for us, it doesn't even, the reality of it is it doesn't even strike a bell, of course.
Right.
You don't
right.
see it, even though it's mentioned. I imagine in the 50s or 40s and 51, it probably was a little bit more noticeable. Yeah. Yes, Phyllis.
I think the first thing I remember as a girl was reading Exodus, and that was what brought everything alive to me.
Yeah.
I also remember being in USY and having debates whether we're Jewish Americans or American Jews.
Absolutely. Me too. That was the late 60s, early 70s, even into the late 70s. That was a conversation on the minds of Jewish teenagers. Where's my primal loyalty? I remember being in a class. I was in a class where I had a teacher who stopped and said to everybody, forget these dash names. You're not a Chinese American. You're not an Italian American. You're not a Black American. You're not African American. You're not a Jewish American. You're American. And I wasn't old enough to be able to stop and think and say, I wonder if she would have said the same thing about Christianity. Where it might apply to nationalities, would it have applied to her? Would she have been so quick to say you're an American first if she had to choose between her Christianity and her Americanism? I don't know. I wasn't old enough to be able to process the question appropriately. But clearly we went through that period where is our loyalty? And, what's our not where is our loyalty, which is the primary loyalty. We have loyalties to both. All right. Yes, Phyllis Kaufman, and then Natalie.
Okay. All right. Yeah, 2 things come to mind. First of all, Stalin, who was almost as destructive as Hitler, is what it's coming out now against the Jews. And since records are still hidden, we really don't know the full extent of what he was doing in the late 40s and 50s. Right. And also we had in our country McCarthyism, which was anti-Semitism in a more organized form, disguised as anti-communism. So even though we were,
I'm going to go there in a few minutes. Okay. You're right. Yep, you're right. Yes, Natalie and then Stanley.
There's a sort of side to all of this. I'm 5th, 6th generation American. So from my perspective, there was always anti-Semitism. I was always an American who happened to be Jewish. We were very Jewish, Reformed Jewish, but very Jewish. But we were always American first because I had relatives who fought in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. So there's a small group of Jews that have been around from a long, long time.
Yeah, well, that's what we've been talking about for the last 8
And-
weeks.
It was taken for granted. You couldn't become a partner, you couldn't become a president, you couldn't become anything. My parents did not put a business on the front door because we didn't want to get stoned. What we did in the house and what we just did in public was different because my parents had grown up being Jewish, with their parents were Jewish, and their parents were Jewish. I have relatives in 1840 who came to this country.
Right.
So
Right.
anti-Semitism did never go away, and in today's market, we're getting close to being where World War II is.
Right. Stanley?
A couple of books I just want to mention. And one was a Gentleman's Agreement in 47, 48, which ended up being a movie with Gregory Peck. And that showed all of this about the anti-Semitism going on to Jews, even Jewish veterans.
Yep.
And the second book is in 56, is When 6 Million Died. And it basically covers everything you've been covering, from Roosevelt and Breckinridge Long, and why we didn't bomb and why we did what we should have done and shouldn't have done. And it's an excellent book. It was in 56. Right. And I just want to mention one other thing. My father-in-law, who came over from Nazi Germany, and he was there when Hitler got in. He was working, and there's stories, there's a Shoah film, you know how the Shoah it spends 2 hours with people that have experienced this and what they went through. And one thing I asked him one time after services, I said, why didn't y'all do something in 33? What were you going to do? You're working, you're doing all this. You are a soccer player. They stopped you from being on the soccer team. And it just, all the things that happened to you, they called your Jew dogs. Y'all had your brothers ended up in Palestine. Some of y'all got out earlier. And he said, it was very simple. We were going to vote him out in the next election. And that was his answer. And of course, obviously that never happened.
So let me just, thank you. I'm going to recommend two things, and then I'm going to continue. One is, based on what you just said, there's a book called They Thought They Were Free by Milton Mayer. Goes back and looks at 10 lives of those in Germany, the ordinary citizen. How is it, and the same thing is true here in America, how is it that the ordinary human being sat quietly? And it's a brilliant psychological analysis, and I invite you to read it. They Thought They Were Free. In terms of anything to do with World War II, go to the museum, the website of the Washington Museum, Holocaust Museum. You will spend your life on that website. There is nothing nothing that you will walk away not knowing. All right, it is unbelievable. And so that's where I would send you for all things World War II related. Okay. I want to jump ahead to 1954. 1954 is a year in which American Jewry paused to take stock. If you think about it, it was a year-long celebration of the 300th year since the 23 we talked about in 1654 arrived in New Amsterdam. It's the tercentenary, all right, the 300th year. And on such occasions, self-congratulations are in vogue, and I promise you, they fulfilled it. All right, in a special tercentenary issue of the Jewish Quarterly Review, Abraham Newman wrote reading number 7, and I think we're up to the Tobolskis.
Okay, reading number 7. Jewish Quarterly Review, Abraham Newman. Looking back upon past horizons in many lands where Jewish communities have lived, we become conscious of our relatively high accomplishment under American skies. We also come to realize that the evolution of Jewish culture in America is still in its early stages.
And in that same article, in that same journal, Robert Gordis noted, reading number 8, and I've got Lori, you're in the next box.
The thinkers and leaders represented in the following pages share in common a faith in tomorrow, a conviction that American Jewry has its future before it and not behind it, and that its children can attain a creative and meaningful Jewish life here in America.
At the central event of this whole celebration was a dinner at the Sheraton Astor in New York, and the guest of honor and main speaker was President Eisenhower. This former commander-in-chief commended his host for coming from the people, which gave, these are his words, new dimensions of meaning to the concepts of freedom and justice, mercy and righteousness, kindness and understanding, ideas and ideals which were to flower on this continent. Thank you for the honor of being with you, the president concluded. His presence was a major statement. He came and spoke to this group of Jews as he would have spoken to anybody else. Certainly a gracious act, to be sure, but like any politician, it was certainly motivated by his recognition that the position of influence of American Jewry had grown tremendously in the half century that had preceded it. And so Jewish political involvement is now emerging. It was at first somewhat apologetic about getting involved, but they quickly learned that the perception of power bestows power. They began to avail themselves of all the resources to protect and promote Jewish interests, and it made Jews feel somewhat at home in America, not at the same time, not yet quite fully at home. American Jews perceived that the economic integration, which afforded them affluence, was still marginal, that the social acceptance, which gave them status, was still somewhat limited, and that the cultural and religious communities that provided status was fickle. We all realize nothing is absolute. The tensions in the neighborhoods was supplemented by problems within the house, within Jewry itself. There was a declining birth rate, which made survival somewhat questionable, an exploding rate of intermarriage for the first time, and an ambivalent sense of identity. Political scientist Charles Liebman described this sense of unease as the American Jew is torn between two sets of values, those of integration and acceptance into the American society, and those of Jewish group survival. Now, somebody mentioned before this, one of the things that's playing out is McCarthyism. You've also got civil rights revolutions, you've got Vietnam War stuff going on, and you've got what seems to be a lessening of American power and economic dominance. And that touches the Jewish community very deeply. Jews had taken a strong stance in the liberal segment of American society. The majority of the old socialists had become social democrats, and they held FDR as a practical example of the democratic doctrine. There were a hardcore number of Jews who continued to support the Communist Party. It was true, all right, into the 50s, and continued to have a decisive role in shaping the politics of the American Communist Party. And they were joined by the great majority of American Jews who saw in FDR the embodiment of what they conceived to be the promise of America. Here you have a gifted son of aristocratic America, placing his service towards the common people. That's what the JFK image I have in my head is. Whether or not it's accurate, that was the perception, okay? His social and economic programs enabled the socially conscious American Jew to channel what was a messianic energy into acceptable American behavior. Remember, again, now we're talking the 50s, we have Israel. Israel has come into existence. Israel is being perceived as we have it in Birkat HaMazon. We say, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. Israel is perceived as the beginning of messianic times. All right. And so there's this messianic fervor that begins to occur, and it can be fulfilled in through American greatness. Into that walks Joseph McCarthy and unleashes American Jewish unease, coupled with embarrassment because he has several aides who are Jewish. McCarthy's investigations into the communist infiltration of the government often did target Jews, not necessarily because they were Jews, but because they were highly overrepresented in the Communist Party. That's what I just said. Now, I'm not suggesting there's no anti-Semitism here. Let me not be naive, okay? At the same time, though, sometimes there are factors that have an element that are playing out for real, all right? Jewish defendants accused of communist affiliations, guess who the attorneys were? They were Jewish. And the result is you have Jewish organizations terrified that the perception, the stereotype of the Jewish communist is being enhanced before the American people. It's hard. Civil rights. Jews stepped forward. This was a time in which there was a recognition that the experience of others plays on Jews as well. Jewish support for civil rights struggle encompassed the actions of thousands of individuals who were dedicated to making America more just. As an example, 1950, Bella Abzug went to Mississippi to defend Willie McGee. Abzug is remembered as a feminist congresswoman, but she began her career as an anti-racist lawyer. McGee was an African-American who had been accused falsely of raping a married white woman, and Abzug hoped to save him from the electric chair. She went to the US Supreme Court and she argued there, unfortunately, unsuccessfully. She argued that McGee never had a fair trial because Mississippi routinely disqualified Black people from jury service. Unfortunately, he was executed. 1950s, the American Jewish Committee hired a Black psychologist, Kenneth Clark, to study the psychological impact of school segregation on children. And he did find that segregation damages self-esteem, and it fed Jewish efforts, led to the legal brief that was prepared by the NAACP in 1954, which ultimately led to the victory of Brown versus the Board of Education. Rabbis called across the nation called this decision a red letter day in American history. Jewish communal leaders have, during that period, fought for the rights of other groups because they were sensitized. As the impact of the Holocaust became clear, they were sensitized to the fact that words matter, not just actions. I said this yesterday, I want to say it again. Abraham Joshua Heschel basically was clear. Jewish anti-Semitic acts follow anti-Semitic words. We have to be very careful and not yet there's a balance between political correctness and at the same time recognizing words do matter. Think about the fact that our entire high holiday list of al-Khaits, the vast majority of them are the damage that we have done with words. Okay, words matter. And with that, I'll open the floor. We have a few minutes.
I would say that I hope we can teach the Black community what we've done. I think that's a big problem.
So let me share with you, Beverly, that I went to the MLK parade this week.
Oh, good.
We had a Jewish contingent. It was advertised. You know how many Jews were there? 20. How many clergymen were there? 2. Gideon Estes and me.
Yeah, I'm on a group of people from South Africa around the world who were part of the Zionist youth movement. And one of them is a historian, a Jewish historian who's a historian at the Hebrew University. And he says that in his analysis, South African Jews did more against apartheid than American Jews for civil rights.
Yeah. So
It's
just
not true that we were that prominent.
right.
We
I
like to
get that.
accentuate it, but it's not true.
I get that, but it really is. If that's the case, then we need to correct it.
Correct.
We need to tell what we did do.
We need to tell what we did
Not
do.
say we didn't do enough, but we need
Right.
to tell the Black community what we did do.
And now we need, yes, and we need now to do. So I'm going to tell you that I have a particular belief on some of this. One, the reason for me the parade was important was to walk down the street with a kippah where there's lots and lots of African Americans, so that there's a message being communicated. I like dialogue groups, but I think they're less effective. And one of my goals is the next time we have a mitzvah day is to join a Black church with us, because there's a power to working together that words together doesn't achieve. Let's, all the psychology studies say you want to bring people together, give them a common cause, let them work together and humanize one another. So that's one of the goals that I hope that we do as a congregation. Yes, Joyce.
I really agree with you, Cantor. I remember years ago being part of a federation group, which was a Jewish Black group. And it was very obvious that what the Black community wanted was not words, it was actions.
Right.
And they did, because they found words to be to lessen their importance, to show Jewish superiority is what I'm trying to say. And then
right.
And that was very destructive.
Right.
So
the words come across as "we will take care of you."
Right.
So there's
exactly.
a hierarchy that's communicated through that kind of language, as opposed to just being with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mark, I had a comment about the spiritual dimension of the Holocaust. And you talk about people like Emil Fackenheim and others. The Jews that came to this country tend to be less religious. The people who remained in Europe tended to be more observant. So more of them died. And the question of where God was while 6 million Jews died is a really hard spiritual, religious question to answer. What was God doing that he allowed this to happen? And of course, there are some crazy people, I think, in the very observant community who say it's because we didn't observe the halakha properly, we deserved all of this, which is kind of bizarre in my mind. But it is a challenge to us that this event happened to the people of the book and the chosen people and so forth. It's a really hard question.
So this, you've opened Pandora's box, because this is right, one of the more. So Martin, you're right. That by the way was the traditional response, that we were responsible for what happens to us. So if you look back on the destruction of the temple, when 1/3 of the Jewish world's population was killed in those wars, what was the response? Jewish arguments. We brought it on ourselves that God did this as a punishment to us. And we accept that. That's the argument we accept for why the temple was destroyed. When we look at the Holocaust, suddenly when it's more modern, we realize that's ridiculous. That's a terrible argument. All right. There are modern scholars who would say with the Holocaust, God gave up his part of the covenant. I just read that somewhere. I can't remember. It was a very well-known scholar who said that. I'm not going to pretend that I have the answer. Yeah, that would be incredibly audacious. That's not happening. All right, but it is a struggle. How do you make sense of that kind of suffering? You certainly have Richard Rubinstein's response of God is dead. At least the understanding of God is dead. No, I have no answers. I do know that the argument about it's our fault doesn't work. Yeah. David?
Cantor, you made a comment, I don't know, halfway through about marketing, and you sort of glossed over the fact that the Palestinians had figured out how to do this.
Mhm.
So my question to you is, with all the smarts that Jews have in marketing and other spheres of business, why have we not managed to pull together a cohesive response, not only to what the Palestinians are doing, but generally the things that help put us on the map in a better light?
It's a great question. You know, when someone says to me, look, the Jews and Israelis have all the power and the Palestinians are just poor, defenseless people. I said to him, have you seen a map? Have you seen where Israel sits? To call Israel the power is silly. And yet, what unfortunately, since 1967, there was a shift. In 1967, we went from David to Goliath in terms of perceptual, the world's understanding of who we are. I don't know the answer. You're right. The question is, why haven't we been able to reshape the conversation so that it's clear that we're not, you know, Iran is sending all this money to the Palestinians to continue the fight. We're not just fighting the Palestinians. They're not an independent group of people sitting by themselves. I don't know why we haven't been able to shape this. I don't know. It seems to me you're right. We should be bright enough, but we haven't.
We are too diverse in our opinions, I think.
Yeah. Yep. And the far left has bought it. Far left of Jews has bought it. All right. By the way, I'm not picking on anyone in particular. I happen to believe that far left and far right both scare me. You know, Jews survive best in a centrist world. Is my basic feeling.
Well, extremism is dangerous no matter where it is.
Right. That's exactly the case. Balance is good. Anybody else? All right, yes, Jeff.
I have a question. How do we resolve the Torah commands that, you know, God will result in our destruction or attack if we don't follow all of the laws correctly?
You know, V'halyayim Shemoah. If you, then you get rain, and if you, then you don't get rain, and you'll all die.
Yeah, so I mean, how do we resolve that with the Holocaust? I mean, that is one way of interpreting, you know, that it's God's punishment for what we've failed to do.
So I'm going to respond now as a conservative Jew. This is where the Chabad rabbi would flick me and pisk. Okay. Okay. I don't take the Torah as the exact word of God. I take it as the understanding of a people in its time. All right. That was the world understanding. When one nation defeated another, it's because my gods were more powerful than your gods. They understood the world as being under the influence of divine direction. All right. So for me, that doesn't, I get it. I understand the Torah in its times. I understand that the underlying principles have great value because they've enabled a 2,000-year existence. Right? There's a great value to this document. There's a great value that it is a striving to understand what God wants of us. And that there are kernels of divine elements within it. That I buy. But to take every piece of it and accept it as that's dogma, well, I'm got to tell you, I don't know, you know, if we look around our community and everybody who's had an affair, you know what? They all need to die. Well, that's an awful lot of people. All right. If you take the Torah in its literal sense, again, read the book "Living the Year of Living Biblically."
Yeah.
Read this book as a sociologist who tries to take the Bible in its. I have it here. Let me hold it up. Hold on one second. It says one man's humble quest to follow the Bible as literally as is possible. It's the year of living biblically. If you want to laugh your head off, just as one example, he walks around, he's got pebbles in his pocket. And he walks around, and if he sees someone he thinks might be an adulterer, he throws a pebble at their feet because the Bible says they are to be stoned. Okay? You have to be able to look at it in its time. The Bible has to be, in my mind, has to be evaluated in the same way we look at every other document. It can't stand outside of literary, archaeological, and historical analysis.
I just.
So I've given my lecture. Yes, Beverly.
I just turned the page on the newspaper and the headline is Jewish Leaders Defiant After Hostage Siege. So I haven't read it, but maybe that's an interesting thing to think about for us today.
Okay. Yeah.
That they're angry.
Yeah. Without question. Without question. Yep. Keep reading. One of the things I said yesterday, awareness. We need to stay aware. All right. Thank you all. We'll play again next week.
Okay. Great program.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was wonderful
you.
as always.
Wonderful. See everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.